In the dry summer of 1988, Arthur Penhaligon turned down a $4,500 diesel irrigation pump and bought 90 geese instead. His neighbors in the Black Kettle Valley thought he'd finally lost his mind. 34 years later, his was the only farm with water, and the top stones of Springhouse nobody had seen since 1934 were once again dry in the summer sun. Let me tell you about the valley, because the land is the first character in any story worth telling. Black Kettle Valley wasn't a Grand Canyon or a picturesque dale. It was a shallow, 8-mile-long depression carved by a creek that was ambitious in April and apologetic by August. The soil was good, a dark, heavy loam that held water if you treated it right. For 150 years, the families there had treated it right. They were dairy men and corn growers, people who understood their specific 200-acre patch of the world with an intimacy that felt genetic. The Penhaligon farm sat at the valley's lowest point, 120 acres of pasture and hayfield that bordered the creek itself. And on that farm was a 3-acre pond, murky and overgrown, that had been a part of the landscape for as long as anyone could remember. Arthur Penhaligon was 68 years old in 1988. He had been farming that land for 52 of those years, since he was a boy of 16 following his father, who had followed his own father. He was a quiet man, known for two things: the unwavering straightness of his fence lines and his habit of pausing for a full 10 seconds before answering any question. He wore denim overalls bleached pale by the sun and a succession of identical gray work shirts. His physical presence was minimal, but his stillness had weight. When Arthur Penhaligon stood in a field, he looked less like he was standing on the land and more like he was a feature the land itself had produced. The problem arrived in the form of a man named Mark Rinslow. He was 29, with a new degree in agricultural science from the State University and the unshakable confidence that comes from knowing the world as a series of data points. He worked for the county extension office, and his job was to bring modern, efficient solutions to farmers who were still, in his view, operating on habit and folklore. He came to the valley in April of 1988, driving a government-issue Ford sedan that was too clean for the gravel roads. He called a meeting at the Grange Hall. 30 farmers showed up, Arthur among them. Rinslow stood at the front of the room with a slide projector and a stack of charts. The slides showed precipitation averages over the last 50 years. They showed rising average summer temperatures. They showed soil moisture depletion models. The data was clear, he said. The valley was entering a cyclical drought pattern, the worst since the 1930s. The creek would be dry by July. Traditional methods would not be enough. He projected a photograph of a gleaming red diesel pump, the Deutz Alice DP-40. It could pull 250 gallons a minute from a deep-drilled well. It could feed a quarter-mile of irrigation pipe. It was, he said, crop insurance in a cast-iron housing. And because the state had declared a potential agricultural disaster zone, the government was offering a 50% subsidy, a $9,000 system for $4,500, a guaranteed return on investment. He had the paperwork right there. The men in the room, practical men who trusted numbers they could hold, were convinced. They saw the logic. They remembered the dry summer of '76. They saw the price of corn rising and knew what a lost crop would mean. Dale Everton, who farmed 300 acres of corn on the valley's western slope, stood up. Dale was 55, a man whose opinion carried weight. He asked Rinslow about fuel consumption, about maintenance schedules. Rinslow had the answers ready. 12 gallons per hour at 1,800 revolutions per minute. A 500-hour service interval. Dale nodded, satisfied. One by one, the other farmers began asking for the forms. Frank Miller, a dairyman whose pastures were his lifeblood, signed up for 2. Rinslow noticed Arthur Penhaligon sitting silently in the back, his hands resting on his knees. He hadn't moved. He hadn't asked a question. Rinslow, flushed with success, walked over to him. He saw an easy final victory. "Mr. Penhaligon," he said, his voice friendly, confident, "can I get you the paperwork for a pump? Your farm is right on the creek bed. You'll need it more than anyone when it runs dry." Arthur looked not at Rinslow, but through him, out the grimy window of the hall toward his own land. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. The other farmers, stuffing papers into their pockets, paused to listen. Finally, Arthur spoke. His voice was low, gravelly from disuse. "The water isn't gone," he said. "It's just plugged." Rinslow smiled, a patient, condescending expression he had perfected for dealing with old-timers. "Plugged? What do you mean, plugged?" "The water table is dropping, sir. We have geological surveys. The aquifer is under stress. That's a scientific fact." Arthur's gaze shifted from the window to the young man's earnest face. "The spring is under the silt," he said, as if stating the time of day. "My grandfather wrote it down. The pond isn't a pond. It's a cap." Renslow's smile tightened. He had heard things like this before. Family folklore. Dowsing rods. Planting by the moon. He put a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "With all due respect, Mr. Penhaligon, we're talking about modern agronomy. We have to make decisions based on data, not stories. This pump is a sure thing." Arthur Penhaligon gave the young man a long, slow look. It wasn't hostile. It was diagnostic, the way a mechanic looks at an engine that's making a funny noise. Then he stood up. He was an inch shorter than Rinslow, but somehow seemed to take up more space. "My grandfather's sure thing is buried under 3 feet of mud," he said. "I think I'll try his way first." He turned and walked out of the Grange Hall, leaving behind a room of silent men and a confident outsider who was already shaking his head in pity. The next week, Dale Everton's new well was drilled. It cost him $3,200 to go down 180 feet, where they hit water that the driller promised would never run dry. His big red pump was delivered 2 days later. By the end of May, 17 new diesel pumps were installed in Black Kettle Valley. Their rhythmic chugging became the new soundtrack of the summer. Arthur Penhaligon did not drill a well. He drove his 1972 Ford F-100 pickup truck 90 miles east to a hatchery near the state line. He spent the morning walking among pens of noisy, aggressive birds. He consulted a small, leather-bound journal he carried in the bib of his overalls. The journal was his grandfather's, the cover worn smooth, the pages filled with spidery cursive that documented 70 years of life on the farm. He found the page he was looking for. The entry was dated May 1st, 1921. "Brought in 40 Toulouse geese for the lower pond. They are devils for weed and will stir the bottom like no machine can." Arthur bought 90 Emden geese. They were a heavy breed, pure white, known for their foraging ability and placid temperament. He chose them over the Toulouse because the hatchery owner said they were better mothers, and Arthur was thinking not just about this year, but the years to come. The goslings cost him $25 each. The total came to $2,250. He paid in cash from a worn canvas bank bag. He loaded the crated geese into the bed of his truck and drove them home. His grandson, Caleb, was waiting for him. Caleb was 19, home from his first year at the same state university Mark Rinslow had attended. He was studying business. He had been at the Grange Hall meeting, standing in the back, and had felt a hot flush of embarrassment at his grandfather's exchange with the extension agent. He saw the geese in the truck bed, and his stomach sank. "Grandpa, what are those for?" Arthur unlatched the crates. "For the pond," he said. Caleb gestured vaguely toward the west. With a faint thrum of Dale, Everton's new pump could be heard. "Mr. Everton has a pump. Everyone has a pump. They said you'd lose the whole crop." Arthur lifted a crate and carried it toward the overgrown pond. The water was stagnant, covered in a thick mat of green duckweed and water hyacinth. The edges were choked with cattails. It looked sick. "A pump pulls water out," Arthur said, setting the crate down. "We need to let water in." He opened the crate. The geese spilled out, hesitant at first, then surging toward the water with a chorus of honks. They hit the surface and immediately began to feed, their heads disappearing under the green scum. Caleb watched, confused and frustrated. He saw $2,250 of foolish pride swimming in a stagnant pond while the future of the farm withered on the stalk. He didn't understand. He didn't have the context. Let me tell you about the Springhouse. It was built in 1881 by Arthur's great-grandfather, a stonemason from Cornwall. He had found a powerful artesian spring at the lowest point of the property, where water pushed its way up through a fissure in the limestone bedrock. He dug down 10 feet, walled the fissure with fieldstone, and built a small 12 by 12-foot stone house over it, with a slate roof and a heavy oak door. The water that flowed from it was a constant 56 degrees, cold enough to keep milk and butter fresh all summer. It produced, according to the journal, 50,000 gallons a day, year in and year out. It was the heart of the farm. For 50 years, it never failed. In 1934, the world changed. As part of a New Deal project, the government built a small hydroelectric dam on the river that Black Kettle Creek fed into 10 miles downstream. The project was meant to bring power and progress to the region. What it did for the farmers in the valley was raise the water table. The creek, which had once been a brisk, clear-running stream, became sluggish and wide. The low-lying pastures turned marshy. And on the Penhaligon farm, the water level rose until it submerged the Springhouse completely. The pond was born. First the stone walls disappeared, then the slate roof. By 1936, there was no sign it had ever existed. Arthur's father, a man who trusted the government more than his own father did, saw it as a blessing. A 3-acre pond for the cattle. He didn't see that the spring, now fighting against the immense pressure of the pond water above it, was being slowly choked. Over the decades, silt and decaying vegetation settled on the bottom, forming a thick, dense layer of muck. This layer, like a clay seal, began to suffocate the spring. Its flow dwindled from 50,000 gallons a day to a mere trickle, just enough to keep the pond from drying up completely in the hottest summers, but not enough to feed it. The pond became a closed system, stagnant and dying. The memory of the Springhouse faded into family lore, a story Arthur's grandfather told that seemed more myth than history. But he had written it all down in his journal. He had drawn a map. He had documented the flow rate. And he had written one critical sentence, dated 1938. The water is still there, but is trapped. Something must stir the bottom. For the next 2 months, Arthur Penhaligon and his 90 geese went to work. Every morning at dawn, he would walk to the pond. The geese would greet him with a cacophony of sound. He would scatter a few pounds of cracked corn, just enough to supplement their foraging. Then he would sit on an old tree stump and watch. The geese were a biological dredging machine. They were relentless. They worked from sunrise to sunset. Their primary job was clearing the surface vegetation. For the first 2 weeks, they devoured the duckweed and water hyacinth, clearing acres of green scum. The sun, for the first time in decades, could reach the water. Their second job was performed by their feet. Emden geese have large, powerful, webbed feet, and they paddle constantly. As they swam and foraged, their feet churned the top layer of silt. This constant agitation prevented new sediment from settling and began to stir the lighter particles into the water column, where they could be broken down by aerobic bacteria that thrived in the newly sunlit water. Their third and most important job was excavation. They were after the tender roots and tubers of the cattails and other weeds growing in the deep muck. To get to them, they would upend themselves, their heads and necks disappearing as they dug into the bottom, their feet paddling furiously to hold them in place. They looked like 90 synchronized swimmers practicing a move. Each time a goose dug for a root, it broke apart a small section of the compacted, 50-year-old layer of silt. They were doing with their beaks and feet what a dredging machine would do with a diesel engine and a steel scoop, but they were doing it slowly, methodically, and without burning a single drop of fuel. They were aerating the muck, breaking it down, and slowly, millimeter by millimeter, loosening the seal that was suffocating the spring. The neighbors watched, and they laughed. Dale Everton would drive by on his tractor and shake his head. "How's the goose-powered irrigation working out, Arthur?" he'd shout, a grin on his face. Arthur would just raise a hand in greeting and say nothing. The laughter was good-natured, but it was edged with pity. They saw an old man retreating into eccentricity while the modern world passed him by. They heard the steady chug of their pumps, felt the reassuring spray of water on their thirsty corn, and knew they had made the right choice. By mid-June, the rains had stopped completely. A high-pressure system settled over the region and refused to move. The days grew hotter, the sun a white, unforgiving disk in a hazy sky. The temperature hit 95 degrees, then 98. The creek shrank, leaving cracked mud flats where water used to be. By the first week of July, Black Kettle Creek was officially dry. The pumps in the valley ran day and night. The sound was a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated in the air. The cost of diesel fuel went up 15 cents a gallon. Frank Miller had to buy a 500-gallon tank just to keep his 2 pumps fed. The corn on Dale Everton's farm looked beautiful, tall, green, and healthy. Arthur's hayfields, by contrast, were starting to turn brown. He wasn't irrigating. He was saving what little moisture was in the soil. Caleb, his grandson, grew more anxious with each passing day. He argued with his grandfather in the evenings. "We have to do something, Grandpa. We could still drill a well. We're going to lose everything." Arthur would listen patiently, his eyes on the journal open on the kitchen table. The entry for July 15th, 1922 read, "Driest summer in memory. The spring holds. The pond is down, but the flow is steady. Patience, Caleb," he would say. "The work isn't finished yet." By the 3rd week of July, the first sign of trouble appeared on the other farms. Frank Miller's shallower well, the one that was only 120 feet deep, began to sputter. The pump would suck air for a few minutes every hour. The driller came back and told him the water table was dropping faster than anyone had predicted. It had dropped 15 feet in 3 weeks. The constant draw from 17 high-capacity pumps was draining the aquifer like a leaky bathtub. A week later, Dale Everton's pump, drawing from 180 feet, began to do the same. The deep, confident chug was now interrupted by a frantic, high-pitched whine as it hit air. He had to start turning it off for hours at a time to let the well recover. His corn, so green and promising a month ago, began to show the stress. The lower leaves started to yellow and curl. The mood in the valley shifted. The good-natured jokes about Arthur's geese stopped. The farmers would drive by his place slowly now, their faces grim. They saw the geese still working, the pond now mostly clear of surface weeds, its water a murky brown from the suspended silt. They saw Arthur's browning fields, and they saw an old man who seemed utterly untroubled by the unfolding disaster. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the change happening on the bottom of the pond. Inside the Penhaligon farmhouse, the tension was thick. Caleb had started looking at brochures for agricultural jobs in other states. He loved the farm, but he couldn't watch his grandfather's stubbornness ruin it. One evening, he confronted him again. "Mark Renslow called," he said. He heard the wells were running dry. He said it's not too late to get a pump. He said he could expedite the paperwork. Arthur looked up from cleaning a rifle at the kitchen table. He was methodical, his hands sure and steady. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "What did you tell him?" Caleb couldn't meet his eyes. "I told him I'd talk to you." Arthur slid a clean patch through the rifle barrel. "And what are you going to tell him when he calls back?" "I don't know, Grandpa. I think we should do it." Arthur laid the rifle down and looked at his grandson. His expression was not angry, just tired. He opened the journal and pushed it across the table. He pointed to a passage written by his great-grandfather in 1882, a year after the Springhouse was built. "Read that," he said. Caleb picked up the journal. The cursive was elegant and precise. "The nature of this spring is not volume, but persistence. It is fed by the deep stone, not the shallow rain. It will survive any drought, for its source is not in the sky of this year, but in the earth of 1,000 years." Caleb looked up. He still didn't understand. "It's just a story, Grandpa." Arthur shook his head. "No, it's an instruction manual." He closed the journal. He told Renslow we're fine. The first week of August was brutal. The temperature stayed above 100 degrees for 6 straight days. For more wells in the valley went dry. The rhythmic hum of the pumps was replaced by an unnerving silence. The cornfields turned from green to yellow to a desiccated, ghostly tan. The leaves rustled in the hot wind with a sound like paper burning. It was the sound of a year's work turning to dust. Farmers who had invested thousands of dollars in pumps and wells now stood to lose everything. They had bet on a technological solution, and the technology had failed because it was applied to a problem it couldn't solve. A pump can only draw water that is there. Their solution was extractive. It was a one-way transaction. On Arthur Penhaligon's farm, the geese worked on. The change in the pond was now visible to the naked eye. The water level had dropped by 3 feet, exposing a muddy shoreline. But the water itself was changing. It was less murky. The heavy silt, stirred and consumed by bacteria, was clearing. Near the center of the pond, where the geese concentrated their digging, Caleb thought he saw something. A subtle disturbance on the surface. A shimmer. It wasn't a ripple from the wind. It looked like a welling up from below. He told his grandfather. Arthur just nodded. "It's getting closer," he said. On August 14th, the climax arrived. It wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible event. Caleb was walking the edge of the pond just after dawn. The air was already hot and thick. He was looking at the spot in the center, the place that shimmered, and he saw it. A single, dark gray stone breaking the surface of the water. It was angular, not a natural river rock. It was a corner, a piece of a wall. He ran back to the house, his heart pounding. "Grandpa, come quick." Arthur walked with him to the pond's edge. He didn't hurry. He looked out at the stone. It was the northeastern cornerstone of his great-grandfather's Springhouse. After 54 years, it was visible again. Arthur stared at it for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he turned to Caleb. "Go get the shovel," he said. They spent the day digging a narrow trench from the pond toward the nearest hayfield. The ground was baked hard as ceramic. It was slow, back-breaking work. By evening, they had a 50-foot trench, a foot deep, leading away from the pond. They stopped. "Now we wait," Arthur said. They didn't have to wait long. The next morning, there were 2 stones visible. The day after that, 4. The top course of the old Springhouse wall was emerging from the water. The geese, their work on the deep muck complete, now patrolled the edges. The shimmer in the center was no longer a shimmer. It was a clear, steady boil of water rising to the surface. The spring, freed from its prison of silt, was flowing again, and it was flowing with a pressure that was slowly, but measurably, beginning to refill the pond. The water in Arthur Penhaligon's pond began to rise. By August 20th, the pond level had risen 6 inches. Water began to trickle into the trench Caleb and Arthur had dug. A tiny, muddy stream snaked its way into the parched hayfield, disappearing into the thirsty soil. The next day, the flow was stronger. The day after, stronger still. Arthur used an old tractor blade to carve shallow, branching channels through the field, guiding the water. It wasn't the high-pressure spray of a modern irrigation system. It was a slow, patient soaking, a gentle giving of water that the ground could actually absorb. The neighbors saw. Frank Miller was the first to stop. He pulled his truck over and got out, walking to the fence line. He was a proud man, but his pride had been baked out of him by the sun. His dairy herd was down to drinking trucked-in water that cost him $400 a day. He just stood there, watching the silver ribbon of water spread across Arthur's field. He didn't say anything for 5 minutes. "Arthur," he finally said, his voice cracking. "How?" Arthur walked over to the fence. He didn't point to the geese or the pond. He just looked at Frank's exhausted face. "The spring is open," he said. "Can you spare any?" Frank asked. "Just for the herd. I'll pay you." Arthur shook his head. "Don't need you to pay. Bring your water tank over this evening. We'll fill it." That evening, Frank Miller's 1,000-gallon water trailer, hitched to his tractor, rumbled down Arthur Penhaligon's driveway. Arthur had hooked up a small, 1-horsepower electric pump, not to the pond, but to the trench. A simple, low-cost pump that used a trickle of electricity to move water that was already flowing freely. It filled the tank in an hour. The next day, Dale Everton came. He didn't ask. He just stood by his truck, staring at the greening patch in Arthur's hayfield, a vibrant anomaly in a landscape of brown. He had lost his entire corn crop, 300 acres, an investment of over $80,000 in seed, fertilizer, and fuel, all gone. The bank would own his farm by Christmas. He was a broken man. Arthur walked over. Dale wouldn't look at him. "I was a fool," Dale said to the ground. "Laughed at you." There's a lot of that going around, Arthur replied. Dale finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. You try to tell us. The water has a memory, Arthur said. You just have to know how to listen to it. Let me tell you about the aftermath, because the consequences of choice are always more important than the choice itself. Arthur Penhaligon did not lose his farm. His hayfields, revived by the spring water, produced a late but healthy second cutting. He had enough hay to feed his own small herd of cattle and enough left over to sell, at a premium, to desperate dairy farmers like Frank Miller. He didn't get rich. That was never the point. He survived. Dale Everton lost his farm. The bank repossessed it in November. It was bought by an out-of-state corporation that planted it with soybeans and irrigated it with 3 new, deeper wells drilled at a cost of $25,000 each. They were chasing the water tabled down into the earth. Frank Miller held on, just barely. Arthur gave him free water for his herd through the rest of the summer and into the fall. The next year, Frank sold half his land, drilled a deeper well on the remaining half, and scaled back his herd. He never laughed at an old man again. Of the 17 pumps installed in the valley in 1988, 9 were repossessed by the end of 1989. The farmers who kept them found themselves on a technological treadmill, drilling deeper, buying bigger pumps, burning more fuel, chasing a resource they were actively depleting. Their solution had made them more fragile, not less. Mark Rinslow was transferred out of the county the following year. The official reason was a promotion. The unofficial reason was that his data-driven confidence had led an entire valley to the brink of ruin. Years later, in 2005, he came back. He was in his mid-40s now, heavier, the certainty in his eyes replaced by something more cautious. He drove down Arthur's lane. Arthur was 85 then, still working. Caleb, now 36, was running the farm with him. Rinslow got out of his car. The pond was clear and deep, the slate roof of the Springhouse fully visible, sitting in the middle of the water like a small island. A flock of more than 200 geese patrolled its surface. A steady, reliable stream of water flowed from a simple pipe outlet at the pond's edge, feeding a network of irrigation ditches that watered the lush, green fields. Rinslow walked up to Arthur. I just came to say you were right. Arthur, who was mending a fence, didn't stop his work. He twisted the wire tight with his pliers. Right about what? About the water, Rinslow said. We had all the data, all the models. We were looking at the numbers. You were looking at the system. We never even thought to ask what was under the pond. Arthur finished the splice and tested it with his hand. It was strong. He finally looked at Rinslow. It wasn't in your numbers, he said. The journal isn't data. It's knowledge. There's a difference. Caleb inherited the farm when Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 92. He inherited the 120 acres, the old farmhouse, and the herd of cattle. But the most important things he inherited were the leather-bound journal and the flock of geese. He understood now. He understood that the farm was not a factory for producing crops, but a complex living system. The geese were not a quirky, old-fashioned solution. They were a critical component of the system's health. They were the keepers of the spring. They were the low-tech, self-replicating, multi-generational maintenance crew. Their work cost nothing but a little cracked corn, and their payment was life itself. The story of Arthur's geese became a quiet legend in the region. Agricultural students from the state university, the same one Rinslow and Caleb had attended, started coming to the farm. They came with water testing kits, soil sensors, and drones. They measured the spring's flow rate. It was a steady 48,000 gallons a day, almost exactly what Arthur's great-grandfather had recorded in 1882. They documented the biodiversity in the pond. They wrote papers about biological remediation and sustainable agriculture. They use a lot of new words to describe a very old idea. What survives is not always what is most efficient. What is efficient is often brittle. A diesel pump is fantastically efficient at pulling water from a well, but it is useless when the well is dry. It solves one problem, water delivery, by creating another, resource depletion. It is a monologue. The farmer speaks, the earth is forced to listen. Arthur's geese were the opposite. They were inefficient, slow, and messy, but they were resilient. They didn't just solve a problem. They healed a system. They reopened a conversation between the land and the water that had been silenced for half a century. The fundamental conflict was never between a pump and a flock of geese. It was between two different ways of seeing the world. One sees the world as a machine to be optimized, a set of resources to be extracted. It is a view that is confident, data-driven, and shallow. The other sees the world as a living community to which we belong, a web of relationships to be nurtured. It is a view that is patient, humble, and deep. One way of seeing leads to a valley of ruined farms and broken men. The other leads to a pond with a springhouse in the middle and water for your neighbors in a time of drought.